my channel. In this video I just wanted to basically talk about an article I found online from the Springer link from November 2019 entitled Critiques of the Neurodiversity Movement, and it was written by someone called Ginny Russell. Now, the person who wrote this article, Ginny Russell, I think is an advocate of the neurodiversity movement. I don't think she's against it. But in this article, she was basically just bringing up some of the arguments, some of the arguments against the neurodiversity movement, just sort of like summarising some of the criticisms. And obviously, as you know, because I talked about it quite a lot, I am very critical of the neurodiversity movement because I think it is basically like an identity politics, political club. It basically almost is like a political party, which I haven't signed up to as an autistic person because I don't believe in its ideology, essentially, as I've talked about elsewhere. And there are people who are critical of the neurodiversity movement across the political spectrum for various different reasons. Obviously, I guess those who are critical of it from a left-wing perspective, as I am, will have different reasons for being critical as maybe those from a more right-wing perspective. But there's some element of agreement in those who criticise it. There's often like areas of agreement, regardless of like where politically you're coming from. Because people often think that the neurodiversity movement is kind of a left-wing progressive thing, and that anyone who's left-wing and progressive will support it, but that's actually far from the case. And actually, it's not always the case either that it's just left-wing and progressive people who support the neurodiversity movement, because there's actually quite a lot of like people, neoliberal kind of right-wing people who support it as well. So it doesn't, so really I don't think you can say that just because someone's at one end of the political spectrum they're going to be for or against the neurodiversity movement. It's more complex than that. Anyway, so I just want to, just kind of like talk through what this Ginny Russell person has said, some of the critiques of the neurodiversity movement. So, first of all, this idea that the neurodiversity movement often talks about there being two distinct populations, so like one neurotypical and one neurodivergent, or neurodivergent, and one group being neurotypical. But that's problematic because they also argue that autistic traits, so not just traits of autism, but other neurodivergent conditions such as ADHD and things like that, they argue that there's an argument that the traits extend into the subclinical population. So that this idea of there being a broad autism phenotype where people who don't meet the clinical diagnostic criteria for autism because they're not clinically significantly impaired, but they might have, say, a large number of autistic traits. In other words, it's not something you can definitively say this is autism, this is not autism. Like, as you know, like there's no blood test, there's no brain scan. At those kind of like borderline areas, it's up to clinical judgment. Is this person clinically significantly impaired enough to warrant an autism diagnosis? It's at the borderlines where there can be the most ambiguity. Obviously, when you are truly in the autism heartland or Asperger heartland, as I guess I am, and other people who are obviously autistic, it's obviously like not, you'll find cross-clinical agreement basically normally. It's kind of quite clear cut, but for those who are like it's more for those people who are basically functioning very, very well in society, who might be successfully married, raising a family, don't need really any much support from the community, are able to kind of forge a life for themselves in their own 2 feet, have quite a kind of normal run-of-the-mill existence, don't appear to be that disabled by most people's standards, but have a large number of these so-called autistic traits. So they might be like a bit socially awkward, maybe find it a little bit hard around people, not be able to read people very well, maybe struggle with eye contact, maybe have a very blunt communication style, maybe quite set in their ways, need a lot of routine and stuff like that. But if they're not clinically significantly impaired, or where the clinical significant impairment is kind of ambiguous, are they clinically impaired, are they not clinically impaired, that's where you'll find the most disagreement and where it can be hardest to diagnose these people. And some will get given an autism diagnosis by some clinicians, another clinician will be like, nope, that person's not autistic. That's where there can be more in a way of disagreement. And then as you get further and further, that's it basically. So obviously you are going to find certain shadow traits of autism in the general population. This has been hypothesised to represent a broader autism phenotype. That's just a construct, by the way, to describe a very disparate group of people who might not have really much in common with one another, but who share a large number of traits that also occur in autism, who appear autistic-light in their kind of interactions and their way of going about life, but who are doing very well and are not disabled. Are they autistic? I would argue personally no, because they're not clinically significantly impaired. Others would argue that they are, but they tend to be people who rave over clinical significant impairment thing. I don't seem to think that's an important distinction when it comes to deciding who's autistic and who's not. I personally think you do need to be clinically significantly impaired to be autistic, because otherwise the condition becomes meaningless as a valid diagnosis, disability. If it just blends into the general population, then I know, what does it mean? In my view, there has to be some cut-off, but obviously it does become difficult when you get to these more complex cases. So there's this argument that there's there's this idea that there's two distinct populations, one neurotypical and one neurodivergent, as though you can draw a line in the sand, say this is neurotypical and this is neurodivergent. There's a sense that actually that's not the case, that this is an arbitrary distinction. And if that is the case, then the whole concept of neurotypical becomes very contentious. After all, is there really such a thing as a typical brain? That's argument for philosophy. And then this is up. Excuse me. There's this problem with this whole idea of neurodivergent superiority, which I think a small minority of people in the neurodiversity movement, and I think it is a small minority. I don't think most people in the neurodiversity movement say this, but there is a minority within the movement who claim that somehow neurodivergent people are superior to neurotypicals, and obviously that's very problematic as well, this idea that a group of people can be somehow superior to another group of people. Sounds a little bit reminiscent of eugenics, if you ask me, not very savoury. Similar issues actually with feminism. Some hardcore feminists have historically said that all men are, rapists. Some feminists have actually said that. They say all men are rapists, or all men are predatory, things like that, which is obviously just not true. Most men are not rapists, most men are not predatory. Aside from it being not true, it is also very sexist in and of itself, because it kind of is a sweeping judgment against all men. And of course, it ignores differences within the male population. So some men are gay and are going to be also face discrimination and stigma because of patriarchy, or disabled men. I mean, the male category is made up of many diverse individuals. So it's a similar thing, claiming that neurodivergent people are somehow superior, and making sweeping statements about so-called neurotypical people treating neurotypical people, in inverted commas, as one camp, when obviously they're made up of many, many different individuals, some of whom will have problems of their own or other disabilities. You know, is just not good. It's discriminatory to make offensive remarks about an outgroup, and yet, indeed, that is what some people in the neurodiversity movement do. Some of them, I think, a minority, do it out of this genuine sense of feeling superior, which is kind of a bit like narcissism, really. But I have also noticed other people in the neurodiversity movement kind of doing it more in a sort of supposedly light-hearted, satirical way, like talking about all the problems neurotypicals have and creating a disorder of neurotypicality and stuff like that, which, while is not quite as blatantly, how can I put it, discriminatory, still kind of leaves a bad taste in the mouth. This kind of out-group and in-group kind of tribalism, which I personally cannot stand. So yeah, is there anyone who's really neurotypical? We've covered that. And the other question is, it's not always clear actually who is in the in-group being neurodivergent people, who is actually in this group, who is neurodivergent. Because for conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, and all the other conditions that are included under its banner, are diagnosed via observation, cognitive testing or self-report, again, not via neurological anatomy. Neurological differences are not seen, but inferred. So we don't really know what's going on in the brain, basically, and yet these people assume some sort of commonality. We are neurodivergent, you are just boring, run-of-the-mill, neurotypical. Which is very unhelpful. We don't know what's going on in the brain fully yet. We don't know that these group of people have any shared resemblance really and anatomically to one another, just as much as neurotypicals in the big inverted commas, make up such a broad group of people with more differences than similarities. That's the problem with any tribal group, the homogeneity, the wanting to kind of suggest that there's a sameness there, and ignoring the difference within groups is basically, reminds me a little bit of fascism. It's not very nice. So moving over to video number 2 now.